Today's episode of the Energy Question podcast is brought to you by Inveris. The energy industry faces challenges every day, and the events of the last 2 years have caused massive disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Inveris is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Inveris has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Inveris.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hello and welcome again to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm David Blackmon. And my guest today, my very special guest, is Michael Cembalest, the Chief Investment Officer at JP Morgan Investments. Michael, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, David.
So, Michael, we wanted to talk today about an annual report you do for JP Morgan, the annual energy report that you put out, which is an amazing compilation of energy and projections about what's going on with the energy transition and the energy space overall. And I wanted to first, before we get into it, give you a chance to talk about what your role is at JP Morgan.
Well, let's see. I've been there. I'm an old timer. I've been there since 1987. And I joined the asset management business in 1998. And I was the chief investment officer for the private bank. And now I'm the chief investment officer across the private bank and also the institutional asset management business, which manages money for pension plans, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and endowments and foundations.
Wow. It's a big job you have there. And you're in New York City, correct?
I am.
So this report is just fascinating to me. I read through it, found myself agreeing with basically everything you talk about in it. A lot of these things are things I've been writing about at Forbes for years now myself, and so it's. I think one of the best parts about it is I got so much confirmation of the thoughts I've been having about all of this. So I'm really glad you were able to come on and join us here. So is the report available to anyone who would like to download it?
Sure. It's if you just search for Elephants in the Room, which is the title of this year's paper, and then JP Morgan, it'll come right up. Yeah. And last year's paper was called Future Shock. You could find both of them in Google pretty easily.
Well, there's so much going on in the energy space. The world seems to change, every 6 months, really. It's just crazy. And one of the statements really on the first page, you recommend to readers, you say, my recommendation as you think about energy issues, ignore all the hype, hyperbole, and hockey stick forecasts, and focus on the actual trends in the energy transition. This leads to, I think, a really good first question. In your view, how is the energy transition actually going? Is the world keeping up with all these net zero by 2050 goals, first of all?
I don't, that's 2050 is such an abstract thing. And with any transition, sometimes the easiest stuff happens first. Right. Think about this. The world's using the optimal places in terms of wind speeds and solar irradiance, right? As you get deeper into the renewable transition, you're going to be choosing the places people passed on first time around. The world's making good progress on one thing and one thing only, which is the gradual decarbonization of electricity consumption used for HVAC. That's basically it, right? Because if you think about the average commercial office building or college campus, there's the decarbonization of the grid, which is pretty gradual, is basically decarbonizing the lighting and cooling taking place in structures.
Yeah.
And I think that would be an accurate way of saying, what progress has been made. And then separately, very little progress has been made on decarbonization of transportation. And then the biggest elephant in the room is there's been almost zero progress on decarbonization of industrial energy consumption, which is how you make plastic, rubber, cement, steel, ammonia, fertilizer, glass, and plastics.
Yeah, and that's such a big aspect of what's happening in Europe, right? With the energy crisis they're having over there, so much of it is industrial use, and they're having to shut down a lot of their big businesses, right? Or at least part of the time to conserve natural gas, especially.
We have a chart that looks at the pace of industrial output in the gas-intensive energy sector in Germany. And it's worse. It's, we have data going back 40 years, and it's at its lowest level on record. And
wow.
they've got two problems hitting them at once. First, you can't build wind and solar fast enough in any country, with the exception of China, which basically doesn't have private property rules and things like that. So they can't build wind and solar fast enough to displace gas on the grid. And then the second thing hitting them is you can't easily electrify the production of a lot of the things the German industry makes. That's one of the biggest misnomers in all of the, green new energy plans and green energy blogs that you read. It's not so simple to say, well, let's just electrify everything. A lot of the stuff that gets made does not conduct electricity. So you can't use electricity as process heat to make it. And that's what a lot of natural gas and coal are used for process heat at very high temperatures for a lot of those industrial goods.
So what's really happening right now anyway, and it may change in the future, but right now, what we're really having is an energy addition, not so much a transition, but we're adding more energy generation capacity to our grids with all the wind and solar that's being built. But a lot of that's coming at the expense of base load, what we have always called base load capacity.
Yeah,
correct?
Yeah. I mean, part of, I would say, in the community of energy people, the energy people have always known that you basically intermittent energy is not a substitute for baseload. But outside the energy community, there are these oversimplified things like levelized cost of energy, which can't handle the concept of intermittent versus baseload. And you end up with a bunch of green tech media articles saying that solar and wind are cheaper than gas. For the marginal kilowatt hour, maybe, but from a system perspective, you've got to load onto your estimate for your cost of wind and solar. Well, how much backup thermal power am I going to need? How much utility scale energy storage am I going to need? I don't need that for gas, but I need that for wind and solar. Yeah. And then how much extra transmission investment am I going to need?
That was going to be my next question.
Right? Because thermal power tends to get built very close to load centers. You can build thermal power wherever you want to build it.
Yeah.
Wind and solar tends to be built really far away from those load centers, and transmission is both costly and politically extremely difficult to build.
So don't you think, and I want to talk about transmission for several minutes here, but one of the things that occurs to me about wind and solar is wind is not versatile. Wind, as you already talked about, has to be built in certain freeways where the wind actually blows. And all you can really do with wind is make the towers taller and the turbines bigger and use more concrete for their pads. But solar is much more versatile. So it seems to me that as this race to build all this stuff out progresses, isn't solar going to be a bigger winner in the long run than wind, because you can do so many different things with it?
It's certainly, if you look at the projections, solar is going to be overtaking wind in the near future. The capacity factors of wind have capped out at about 40%. So even in the best places in the country, which is that wind panhandle that stretches from the Dakotas down to Texas, 40, 42%. And then maybe 10% or so higher in certain offshore locations. But then the costs and the transmission and maintenance challenges are equally difficult. So yeah, solar is going to get a lot more attention, and a lot of solar is being built along with co-located storage. But again, that begs the question of how much is this transition going to cost if every megawatt hour of solar is going to have to be accompanied by some pretty expensive utility scale lithium ion storage. There are some, iron air batteries, there's vanadium redox. There's a lot of research taking place with larger, cheaper stationary batteries. And I think eventually some progress will be made, but it's not going to be free. So, the cost issues here are going to take a while to really unbundle if storage becomes an inseparable component of solar power. And you need all sorts of ramping and extra protections for the grid because of the concentration of solar radiance in the middle of the day. And then you get this demand bump that happens when people go home, just as the solar is dissipating. So
do you think?
Yeah, it's complicated.
And so we talk about the cost of this. We just passed a bill. Congress just passed a $369 billion in new subsidies for renewable energy and carbon capture and all these things.
Yeah.
And isn't that? Do you think people really understand the reality that all that amounts to is a down payment on what the ultimate cost of all this is really going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what they're going to get in terms of bang for the buck.
Yeah.
One thing it's certainly going to make complicated is you will no longer be able to look at household and industrial electricity prices to understand the cost of your energy ecosystem, because there's so many unrelated subsidies that won't be showing up in your electricity price, but they'll show up eventually in your tax bill, right? I mean,
exactly.
Any economist would tell you, right? I mean, the cost of an energy ecosystem is the tax on the public debt used to build it, plus the direct payment to electricity prices. So a lot of people are going to underquote the cost of this transition, because they're going to look at how much we're paying in electricity rates for this new stuff, and they'll be ignoring the cost to all taxpayers of an extra $370 billion of debt at the federal level.
Yeah.
But even with that, it'll be very interesting to see what the throughput from all this money is, because you can dangle economic incentives in front of people, which is really what this bill does. This bill is a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of providing economic incentives.
Sure.
It's a 3 in terms of the pathways for people to execute. And because look, Manchin's citing bill wasn't a part of it, and then has apparently been shelved, at least temporarily, if not permanently.
Yeah.
So here's a perfect example. The bill calls for $7,500 subsidies for EV purchases.
Yeah, EVs, yeah.
Okay. At least half of that $7,500 you only qualify for if you buy a car that gets its critical minerals and battery composition and assembly in the United States or its close allies. Right.
And there are no cars that qualify for that.
Right. No cars qualify for that right now. Some may in the future. Let's see what happens when people start trying to apply for permits in Nevada or Utah for a lithium mining and refining and processing operation. I can anticipate that kind of thing would take 15 years. So so a lot of the things that are in the bill, one of the exercises that we did, and I'll send this to you, I don't know if you've seen this, we laid out all of the assumptions that were made by Manchin and Schumer when they talk about a 40% decline in emissions by 2030. They didn't run those numbers. Obviously, they got them from a consulting firm. I went to the consulting firm and got all their assumptions.
Yeah.
They're assuming a 7-fold increase in the pace of solar power capacity additions compared to the last 3 years. That's a moon landing, war effort kind of pace of building, which would be unprecedented in the history of the United States. And I think, practically speaking, impossible given all of the siting and transmission challenges that we know.
Yeah.
So there's certainly a lot of economic incentives for people to want to build that solar power. Their ability to execute and deliver is an entirely different question.
Yeah, and that brings me to the next question, which has to do with energy minerals and all the minerals that these batteries have to have, and wind and solar, the solar panels are included in the construction of those things. Do you think anyone, and I just talked with the CEO of a battery company the other day about this, asked him the same question. Do you think policymakers in Washington understand the reality that if we're actually going to make this transition work the way they think it's going to work, that our country and Europe and really everybody in the world is going to have to get back into the strip mining business in a big way?
I think, when I talk to the people who work on these bills, they are as far removed from the actual workings of the private sector as you could possibly be and exist in society. So, it's like writing about life on Mars if you've never been there. So in principle, I think they're aware that they've created a bill that is supposed to incentivize the repatriation and onshoring of certain mining activities. What I think they're missing is those activities have gravitated to parts of the world that have minimal to no controls or domestic judicial remedies for environmental pollution.
Right.
For its level of GDP, China is the most polluted country in the world. And we're all aware of the air pollution. The water pollution is worse than the air pollution, and the soil pollution is worse than both. So, they've got arsenic and all sorts of minerals in the soil. So a lot of these activities have gravitated to China, sub-Saharan Africa, places like that, because there are no controls. It's kind of like the CHIPS bill, the semiconductor bill that was just passed. We can certainly make those small chips in the United States. We can, mine and refine lithium and cobalt and manganese. Let's see how much it will cost and how long it would take if it's done in a way that complies with Western standards.
Right.
And I think that's the thing they're missing, is the time and the cost associated to reshore and repatriate those activities.
Yeah, and so it's a great example of this that I wrote a piece recently about a company called Ioneer that is trying to get a lithium mine permitted in Nevada, central Nevada, out in the middle of nowhere. They've been held up for more than 2 years now by the EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and over the mitigations they're going to have to do to protect 10 acres of buckwheat that the Center for Biological Diversity has identified as a, quote, endangered species.
Yeah. A lot of these things are hard for lay people. And, I'm a lay person when it comes to these issues. I get confronted all the time with anecdotes, and it's hard for me to know, okay, where's the line crossed, right? What is something practical and important that we'd all agree to protect water aquifers and drinking water and the health of livestock?
Oh, yeah.
And where does it become gilding the lily? That's a really hard judgment for you to make as a scientist.
It is.
I'll tell you, we have one of our clients is a family that owns wind power in Wyoming. They've been working on a transmission project to get it to the border of California, which is a very energy hungry state. They're in their 17th year, and 80% of the project is on public lands, which has been fast tracked. So 17 years and 20% of the project is on private lands. So, it's a combination of the lack of eminent domain and also some of the environmental issues that you're citing. And so if, to the environmental, this kind of renewable transition is in the slow lane, this is one of the limiting factors. And, the defeat of the Manchin bill was not a good sign in terms of the direction that this is going.
No, it's a terrible sign, because that would benefit everybody. And that's what even the environmentalists, right, who are the groups that are really pushing the energy transition. They're really the driving force behind it. They do not understand, at least as far as I can tell, that all this mining has to take place, and you have to be able to permit this stuff.
Well,
right?
so by the way, a lot of these permitting issues are now being used to block renewable projects as often as they're being used to block non-renewable projects.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the chickens have come home to roost in a way. I mean, I think a lot of the environmentalists never anticipated that these procedures and protections would be used against them. But one of the things you'll read about in the paper that I always talk about is the Northeast is running low on power. And right now, the only plan to upgrade the grid there is by bringing in more natural gas. Over the last 10 years, about $200 million has been lost by proponents of a project to import Canadian hydropower to Massachusetts. First, New Hampshire blocked it, then Maine blocked it. And in both cases, environmentalists were at the center of the effort to block those projects because of the impact that a transmission line, even when buried underground, would have on the forest systems. Okay, you can do that. And I won't dispute that it would have zero impact, but just acknowledge Canadian hydropower at 5 cents a kilowatt hour has a minuscule carbon footprint compared to what Massachusetts is going to have to do instead.
Yeah, they're going to have to import natural gas from overseas because of the Jones Act, right?
Right. And now Massachusetts would say, well, okay, we're really disappointed that project didn't pan out. So now they're going to embark on increased gas imports, but also thinking about offshore wind. But they're going to run into the same challenges with offshore wind that they ran into with onshore hydro, which is, large cost, long delays to development, a lot of environmental permits. And for anybody that's traveled up and down the Eastern Seaboard, the grids on the shore are like pipe cleaners. So you're not going to be connecting some massive 40 or 50 or 60 turbine wind project directly to those teeny little shore-bound grids. You're going to have to get all sorts of permits to do all sorts of rerouting of that electricity back to a stronger, more robust substation. And all of that's more time, more money, more permits.
Yeah. Well, but by the same token, the other side of all this is, I had a buddy tell me, well, the Republicans, they're going to get back in office and they're going to repeal the IRA provisions and all those subsidies. And I'm like, no, that's not going to happen, because by the time you have a new Republican president, assuming you do in 2025,
right,
millions and millions of jobs are going to be dependent on these subsidies, right? So, I mean, these subsidies are there, and these projects are going to go forward almost regardless of what happens in the elections.
Right. And I would also argue that if, in May of this year, the financial markets for elections, which I follow, were pricing in an 80% probability of a Republicans retaking the House and the Senate.
Yeah.
Turns out you can't just pick a bunch of random dudes from a bar and run them as candidates and reliably do that.
Right.
So that red wave has dissipated rapidly. I wouldn't be, I think the Senate is a coin flip at this point, and the House is getting close. So, if to the extent that Republicans want to retake all three branches of government, I think they may have to upgrade the quality of the candidates they're running. That's a personal view.
No, I share that view, and I've taken a lot of heat for it recently, but that's another story. Another thing you talk about, and again, it's on page 1 of the report, you quote Mark Twain's famous quote, reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. And you're talking about fossil fuels in the energy mix. Looking ahead and as you look out on the prospects of this transition happening, how long do you think we're going to be using substantial amounts of oil and gas
I
here in
think
the U.S. and globally?
the world for a long time. I think one of the most ill-advised, and this is a huge issue for us as asset managers, right? We oversee $2.5 trillion worth of money on behalf of institutions and individuals. This notion that the stranded asset theory, I think, is extremely flawed. And the notion is that a lot of proven and probable reserves will never be mined because the world won't need them, creating massive losses for the owners of those reserves and the banks that lend to them. Right now, every indication is that may be true for coal, but is not on the 30-year time horizon for oil and gas. My biggest fear is the opposite. I run all sorts of numbers looking at the pace of electrification of transportation, electrification of home heating through heat pumps, eventual decommissioning of coal and nuclear power. I think in 2035, the United States needs roughly the same amount of natural gas as it's consuming today.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's very ill-advised for any administration to take steps that are designed to weaken the profitability and robustness of the natural gas industry because one, we're going to need it. Two, it looks like the Europeans are going to need it if they're going to wean themselves off of Russian energy.
Big time, yeah.
And three, the industry needs to be profitable if we want them to be able to engage in the kind of methane tracking, monitoring, and repair that is critical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's any question. Nobody questions the benefits of coal to gas transitioning as it relates to CO2 emissions. But some of the methane, whether it's deliberate flaring or accidental leakage, cuts into that benefit because of the global warming potential of methane. This is not super high-tech technology. There can be continuous monitoring approaches that are used to rapidly identify with drones and other satellite footage where those leaks are taking place, and they can be remediated quickly. An industry that's on its back foot and deprived of capital and treated like the tobacco industry is not going to be able to solve that problem for you.
Yeah.
It needs to be one that's making enough money so they can reinvest in the kind of systems so that we can really achieve the true economic and energy benefits of the coal to gas transition.
Yeah. So on current events, we just recently had this sabotage of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, the natural gas pipelines. And that makes LNG, America's ability to export LNG even more critical than it already was.
Europe is trying a little bit of everything, right? They're going to force people to turn down their thermostats in the winter, turn up their thermostats in the summer. They are building emergency floating regasification facilities to take in US LNG and also from Australia and Qatar. They will be more successful than we will in accelerating a siting bill. A lot of those countries are more homogeneous and smaller, and I think will act more quickly in their own self-interest on that front. So they'll build a little bit faster, the wind and solar.
Sure.
And they're even going to experiment with some goofy hydrogen ideas, right? The Germans have gone to the Saudis to use solar power and green electrolysis, and how they're going to get the hydrogen, for which there's no pipeline, how they're going to get the hydrogen from Saudi Arabia to Germany, and what they're going to do with it once they get it's a different story. But it's a little bit of all of the above. But I don't think there's any question that for the next decade, the geopolitical importance of Europe having access to affordable supply of imported natural gas to prevent the continent from unraveling is pretty high. And I'm kind of amazed to see this administration, which professes so much hope and trust in NATO and the European project, like the energy messaging is not aligned with that.
Well, just last week, we see Jennifer Granholm threatening to implement reductions in the ability to export LNG and oil, right? If the oil industry doesn't behave a certain way, how in the world could the U.S. justify doing that given the situation in Europe?
Well, I mean, there's resource nationalism taking place a lot globally, right? So
yeah,
Malaysia, India, Indonesia have restricted exports of palm oil and sunflower oil. You know, a lot of countries are beginning to husband their own resources. When this administration does it, there's a certain irony to it, because they're trying to husband a resource that at the same time they're trying to kill.
Yeah.
So I don't understand all of the moving pieces there. I also, you know, I'll let me phrase this carefully, but there are certain cabinet positions where you can put almost anybody in, right?
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, and Secretary of Energy are three positions that I believe most presidents have recognized historically that people have to have the proper training, background, and subject matter knowledge.
Yeah.
And you know, the current Secretary of Energy is one of the last few that doesn't meet that criteria. And you know, Ernie Moniz, agree with him or not, was kind of the last Secretary of Energy that really had the science credentials to have that job. And you know, I think people in both parties should try to insist that some of those critical cabinet positions be filled by people who have the background to have those positions. And they shouldn't be patronage positions as if you're the ambassador to Croatia.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we could also add the Secretary of Transportation to that list you ticked off, just because of the current situation with supply chains and everything else that's been happening. But anyway, I don't want to get too deep into that. We're out of time, Michael. As I said up front, we were only able to scratch the surface here of this report. I can't recommend it highly enough to my viewers to please go out and download it and read it. You will be much richer in knowledge about the energy situation for having done so. And I really appreciate you agreeing to do this with me. I hope we can have an ongoing
Thank you very much.
conversation.
This is the first podcast I've done on the subject.
Well, I'm honored. I'm really am honored, given your position at JP Morgan. I know it's an incredible time and position for you, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. And thank to all my viewers. And we'll be with you next time on The Energy Question with David Blackmon.